Hello, and welcome to Show and Tell with me, Stephen Leslie. This is episode 1 of what I expect to be a very short run where I show you some photographs and then tell you about them. It's a truly radical, groundbreaking concept. I'm a writer and photographer from London, and I've been taking spontaneous, candid street photos for the last 25 years. And you can find more of my work at my website, www.stephenleslie.co.uk, or Instagram, where I'm step-hen-les-lie. This is the kind of thing I do. None of it's set up or planned, it's all just stuff I happen across, so it's like a visual diary of my life. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a writer as well as a photographer, and a few years ago my book Sparks was published by Unbound and Penguin Cornerstone. The book was a mixture of my photography and stories that I then made up about the images, so it was a blend of fact and fiction. But it's now completely sold out, I've not got any left, and it's selling for stupid money on eBay. I don't know why, but it is. So I've written another one called Mostly False Reports, which will hopefully be coming out later on this year, or at the latest the start of 2023, assuming we all make it that far. But back to show and tell. Why the hell am I doing this? Well, there's a huge amount of photography content online, but most of it seems to be people, actually mainly blokes, talking about their cameras. I'm going to try and resist talking about my camera, which is a Contax T3 by the way. Do you like the look of it? Isn't it lovely? Do you want me to talk about it? Tough, I'm not going to. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and talk about what comes out of it. I'm going to talk about the photographs rather than the cameras. So today I want to start talking about one of my favourite photos of all time, which is this one by Louis Faurer. Before I launch into a great long spiel about this photograph in particular, it's probably worth giving you a little bit of background information on Louis Faurer, because he's maybe not as well known as he should be. He was born in Philadelphia in 1916, and that's where he started his photography, but then he moved to New York in the late 1940s, where he rapidly became friends with Robert Frank. In fact, here's a photograph of Frank in New York, taken by Faurer in 1947. It's not a particularly great one, but it's the only one I could find. Apparently they even lived together for a while in a Manhattan loft along with 9 stray cats, but I couldn't find a photo of that anywhere, so you'll just have to imagine it. But while Robert Frank went on to have a massive reputation and become one of the most famous street photographers ever, Louis Faurer was far more obscure and died in near poverty in 2001 at the age of 84. His career sort of fits between that of Walker Evans, who mentored him, and Frank, whose The Americans was published in 1958. Here's a very small selection of Faurer's New York street work from the 1940s and 50s. He also went and worked in fashion and was notoriously sensitive and tricky. Apparently he once picketed his own show because he wasn't happy with the commission the gallery was taking from him. There's some truly great footage about Faurer elsewhere on YouTube, and I'll try and put the link below this video to where the master printer Chuck Kelton talks about working with him and describes him as being
one of the great American photographers, the first client, the first guy I ever worked for. He was completely insane, right? Because of my personality, I ended up working for Louis Faurer for over 20 years.
So yeah, a complicated man, but a great photographer. By the way, I've only got this relatively recent Steidl volume, which is great, but there's another Faurer book out there, which is this one. It's getting pricey now, but if anyone wants to do a swap with me, let me know. I've got some other books I'd happily trade. Anyway, back to my favourite photo. Why do I like this one so much? Well, it's got nothing to do with it technically. As you can see, it's slightly soft and out of focus. Faurer would have been shooting on very slow, medium format film stock, probably late at night. Most of the light for this image would have been coming from the surrounding billboards and neon in Times Square, and he's doing it handheld, so the result is a tiny bit soft, but that matters not one jot to me, because it's all about the emotion. Quite simply, this is one of the saddest, funniest, most honest photographs that I know. It's both touching and tragic, and that's why I love it so much. It's a truly beautiful, intimate exchange, and if you take street photographs, then you know how hard genuine moments like this are to get. And so the softness doesn't matter. In fact, I think it actually makes it better, precisely because it isn't perfect. It's a human, flawed image of a human, flawed subject. But that's not all. The other reason I love it so much is that, as you probably noticed, it's about a bald man, and I am a bald man too. Louis Faurer was also bald, and whilst this may seem petty, ridiculous or futile, what I'd like to talk about for the rest of this episode of Show and Tell is baldness in photography, in street photography in particular, and what, if anything, we can learn by studying it. Now, the fact is, there's a lot of pictures of bald men out there. There are quite a few of us in the world, and so it's just natural that some people will take our photos. I should probably quickly point out that I'm only going to be discussing bald men in this episode. I'm not going to go anywhere near bald women lest I get slapped. But surprisingly, bald men aren't as common in the history of street photography as you might imagine, and the main reason for this is hats. Good street photography, over time, becomes social documentary and social history. It helps us appreciate how people used to live in the past, and one glaring difference it records is how almost all men in the past used to wear hats. All the bloody time. They never left the house without them. Here's a photo by the great French photographer Jacques-Henri Lartigue of a man, Monsieur Faurer, apparently throwing his dog Tuppy across a river in 1912, and he's wearing a hat, possibly his specialist dog throwing hat. Or here's another man Lartigue photographed in 1908, jumping over some chairs while wearing a hat. Or some men at the races in 1912, all wearing hats, and even checking out another man's hat. The more you look, the harder it becomes to find shots of men without hats, even in cars. And of course, if a man is wearing a hat, you can't tell if he's bald or not. I would be willing to bet that all of these men are bald, but they've all concealed it under their hats. In fact, I would go as far as to theorise that in the past, if a man wasn't wearing a hat, it's probably because he wasn't going bald. This one is also by Lartigue, but taken in London in 1967. And you can see that the men in the background, without hats, all have their hair, but I bet the bloke on the left there, the leering one in the hat, is balding. That's why I love this shot by Martin Parr, because it manages to hit that elusive combination sweet spot of both hats and baldness. I actually think it echoes and surpasses this earlier Joel Meyerowitz photo, which is great, but not quite as good. Incidentally, that's going to hurt, because Parr still has a decent head of hair, whereas Meyerowitz is now famously, proudly, as bald as an egg. Here's a very rare photo of Matt Stewart, Joel Meyerowitz and me at the end there. 3 very bald photographers all in a row. Actually, while I was doing the research for this, I found this great, little-known photograph by Henri Cartier-Bresson, which is the granddaddy of both those previous photos. Taken in New York in 1947, exactly around the same time that Faurer was photographing. This is like the original template bald man in a hat photo. And of course, let's not forget that Henri Cartier-Bresson hated having his own photo taken because he was as bald as a coot himself. But moving on. At some point in recent history, men started wearing fewer hats, which meant that street photographers could start taking more bald-headed shots. But this brings us face to face with the knotty, tangled issue of non-bald photographers taking photographs of bald men and what their motivations or intentions might be. Take, for example, this photograph by Martin Parr. Now, is this photograph just taking the piss? Is it simply Parr being cruel because Parr still has his hair? Who knows? Here's another photograph that Meyerowitz took of the great Hungarian photographer André Kertez. So here we have a bald photographer taking a picture of another bald photographer with a fried egg on his bald pate. Is this sort of thing permitted because both the photographer and the subject are bald? Maybe. Kertez doesn't seem to mind. What's certain is that both Kertez and Meyerowitz understand what it means to lose your hair, and so they're in league. They're sympathetic with one another, and you could argue that means that this photo is coming from a place of love, although maybe that's going too far. This leads me to this amazing, famous photograph by Fred Herzog. Now, this is a great but extremely complex bald photo. Not only did Herzog have a lot of hair, but the bloke in the photo is an absolute bald mess. He's literally in bits, with a broken hand and a bloody chin he's cut while shaving. But when you look again, you'll notice that the disapproving woman behind him is pointedly staring at and being disapproving of what? That's right, his bald spot. That's what she's staring at. This rather neatly leads me to the subject of the female gaze. Not so much from within the photograph, but from behind the camera. What does this all mean for female photographers when they take photos of bald-headed men? Is it exploitation? Is it fair? Is it taking the piss? Poor bald-headed men. This is a truly fantastic bald man photo by Vivian Mayer, but she was a woman with a full head of hair. So is it fair? Well, these ones by Helen Levitt. Or, lest you start thinking that I only look at old photos, these ones by Melissa O'Shaughnessy. I mean, this one with the big finger is cruel, verging on mockery, surely. So should or could bald-headed men only be allowed to take photos of bald-headed men? These are the big contentious questions that I intend to shy away from on Show and Tell. What I do know is that I am bald, and therefore I am allowed to take photos of other bald-headed men. These are my people. And some may argue that I've done it way too much. For the past 20 years or so, I've been creeping up behind bald men and taking photos of their shortcomings. I think you can probably tell that I'm addicted, or ever so slightly obsessed. I currently have 2 restraining orders out against me and an upcoming court case that my lawyer is very pessimistic about. It just goes on and on. Why the hell do I do this? Well, as Minor White famously declared, all photographs are self-portraits. Which is another contentious statement, but it's one I agree with because I really, really don't like having my photo taken. And why is that? Because every time I do, I'm reminded by how much I've lost my hair. But in the spirit of open discussion, here are some photographs of me that graphically illustrate this problem. Like many babies, I was born bald, and I grew my hair slowly. This is a photo of me, my father, our pet monkey McGinty, and a mystery parrot. You can see that my father, who incidentally was a hairdresser, has already lost most of his hair, and had actually donated that large frontal chunk to me. This is a photo of my dad as a young boy when he still had insanely tall hair, with his father, my grandfather, Alan, who was obviously very bald and serving as a warning of what was to come. In the 70s, I had hair and a massive bowl head haircut, probably done by my father. Then, as a teenager in the 80s, I briefly had a quiff. I discovered photography just in time to record my triumphant flat top, and then pretty soon after that, it all fell out. Now I try not to take any selfies at all. I just go around taking photos of other bald men because, as previously explained, all photos are self-portraits. So here I am, yawning. There are, of course, notable exceptions to the street photographers all hate having their photographs taken rule. And the best example I can think of is Louis Friedlander. Friedlander is an incredibly prolific photographer with more published books than you can imagine, but the one project he's never stopped working on is arguably his self-portraits. These date back to his youth, and that's when he had hair. You can't miss it in these relatively early photos. He actually published 2 whole books of his self-portraits, but the thing about Friedlander is that he's not afraid to record his hair's decline. He's very upfront and honest about it. So he might disguise it or make a joke out of it with shadows and such, but then, as he gets older, he's 88 now, he really insists on carrying on. Look at this one. I mean, there's no vanity or crap being given here. Louis Friedlander is now bald, and he's going to photograph that until he dies. There's just 2 more photographers I want to talk about today, and it's a slight change of tone because they're not street photographers. In fact, they're portrait photographers. They're 2 of the greatest portrait photographers that America has ever produced, Irving Penn and Richard Avendon. Apparently they were great rivals. They had very different personalities and used to have dinner with each other just once a year. But that's not what I want to talk about. Obviously what I plan to talk about is Penn and Avendon and their hair. Recently I found this amazing 1964 group shot of famous American photographers. Here's Irving Penn, here's Richard Avendon, and tellingly, all the famous photographers still with their hair have grouped themselves together in a kind of brill-creamed power triangle to the exclusion of all the baldies. Penn eventually lost all his hair, and I would argue that this made him a better, more empathetic photographer. One very quick example of this is how they both photographed the same subject. So here's Irving Penn photographing a youngish Truman Capote who's already starting to lose his hair. Penn went on to photograph Capote for many years, and when Capote did lose all his hair, Penn was sympathetic to this as a bald man himself, and so he would crop the photograph to lessen the amount of shiny scalp on display or allow him to wear a hat. But what happened when Avendon photographed Capote? This. It's merciless, and Capote looks suitably sad. And again, here is a photograph of the artist Saul Steinberg, taken by Avendon in 1969. It's in front of his trademark white backdrop, and so it almost screams baldy at you. And not only that, but Avendon has made sure to get a woman with a full head of hair to stand right next to Steinberg to provide a stark contrast of exactly how follically challenged he is. Avendon is being cruel. But when Penn photographed Steinberg, this is the result. See, Penn was bald. He understood that some days you just don't want anyone staring at your enormous slaphead, and so he lets Steinberg hide. He doesn't shine a great light on his bald dome for all the world to see and laugh at. He's a mensch. He lets him cover up. Interestingly, Penn wasn't afraid to turn the camera on himself to document his own baldness. He produced a great number of distorted and slightly disturbing self-portraits that clearly show him struggling to coming to terms with his own mortality and lack of hair. These are portraits that reveal an angst and self-doubt that Avendon never had to tackle. And if you don't believe me, then take a look at this self-portrait, where Avendon has actually photographed himself midway through tousling his own luxuriant locks. He might as well be saying, "Because I'm worth it," and gloating. Avendon was in his late 50s when he took this, and I bet he showed it to Penn when they went for their annual dinner, and then Penn cried into his soup. Avendon took a lot of photographs of older men like him who still had great hair. He combed America looking for drifters and carnies with extraordinarily thick mops, all specifically to annoy Penn. Although the most amazing one is this diptych of the Irish writer Samuel Beckett. Beckett was in his 70s here, but he's still got more hair than most 20-year-olds, and Avendon has even got him to lean forward so he can show the world that he's not even thinning on top. This photograph is effectively a conspiracy of hirsute men saying "fuck you" to baldies everywhere, although I imagine especially to Irving Penn. When Avendon does photograph bald men, he either makes them look sad like Truman Capote from earlier, or he places an advert looking for a bald beekeeper like Ronald Fisher here. He then covers him in bees as a kind of living parody of hair. And not only that, but instead of ordering juvenile bees that couldn't sting, he went and used adult bees, and so Ronald got stung multiple times just so hairy Avendon could take the piss. And honestly, my last thing about Richard Avendon are these extraordinary photos he took of his own father, Jacob, towards the end of his life. A huge amount has already been written about these complex, somewhat brutal images, but no one has ever yet mentioned the glaring obvious fact, to me at least, that what we're seeing here is Avendon Jr. lording over his dad due to his hair. The son is basically telling his father and the world that, ha, I got to keep mine, and I'm a world-famous photographer. He even has his father lean forward so he can show us exactly how far his hairline has retreated. But let's stop there before I start to sound deranged. I want to end by returning to this photograph by Louis Faurer, because doing all this has made me appreciate another reason why I think it's so brilliant, and that's simply because in most photos of bald people, they're on their own. The photograph focuses solely on the single subject, because being bald, even though it afflicts millions of men, is a relatively solitary thing. You go through it alone. Men famously don't talk about their feelings. We keep them bottled up. We wear hats or have comb-overs, trying to cover up and pretend we're not bald, or not as bald as we really are. But then we get caught out and exposed by the photographer. That's their tragedy and their comedy. That's where their power lies. But this photo by Louis Faurer is brilliant because it's all about a relationship and love as well. It's about a man and a woman and baldness, and it's stronger for that. In fact, the official title for this photo is Woman Smooths a Man's Bald Pate, and that surely is what all bald men are looking for. An ally who will accept them as they are, and maybe even help them perpetuate the myth that they still have some hair. My name is Stephen Leslie, and this has been Show and Tell. If you've enjoyed this, then please subscribe, and I'll try and do another one of these soon without any wigs. There's also a link down below for the new book, Mostly False Reports, so if you sign up to that, I send you a free story. Thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll do another one soon.